The phrase too much of a good thing is probably one of the most debated ideas ever. I mean, if something is good, then why not have more of it? This line of thought usually leads to someone waking up with a hell of a hangover and zero memories of the previous night past 10 p.m. And while this is absolutely me starting off with an overall negative outlook on the army, I feel this very aptly applies to the Fyreslayers. In Warhammer Fantasy, the Dwarf Slayers were a highlight of the faction because they stood out from what the rest of the army of classic dwarfs were. Most dwarfs are clad in enough armor to be mistaken for a small car, and while their melee prowess shouldn't be ignored, their artillery and gunfire was the most fearsome thing to worry about. Slayers, meanwhile, were half-naked berserkers who would immediately rush the enemy front lines because Grimnir demands they die, and that's about as far as most of their battle tactics went. Not always, but more often than not. While they historically weren't exactly meta choices, Fantasy Slayers gave a nice contrast to the rest of the army, and could be fun for less competitive games. Unfortunately, GW crossed some wires somewhere, and fun highlight for an army turned into Army of Nothing But Naked Bears at some point in Age of Sigmar's development. But you know what? They aren't my favorite, but they exist and they're worth talking about. So if you enjoy the idea of showing up to game night with an army of hairy naked men to take you to victory, maybe the Fyreslayers are the army for you in the Age of Sigmar. But before you listen to this video proper, would you like to know how you can listen to it all the better? Well, sit tight, because this message is sponsored by Raycon. To celebrate Raycon turning another year older, take a look at these fine bone conduction headphones. This fine piece of hardware doesn't just play sound, it sends the vibrations straight through your bones. You ain't just hearing the music, you're feeling it. Because of that, whatever you're listening to isn't just crystal clear, you can still hear the world around you just fine. If you're going for a run, shopping for groceries, or whatever else you may be doing, Raycon's bone conduction headphones will make sure you listen to what you want without drowning out the rest of the world. And since they're waterproof, dustproof, and have a 13-hour battery life, you can take them wherever you want without having to worry about damage or running out of juice. I like to use them while I'm either writing or working on minis. Much as I would like to, sometimes I can't just ignore whatever's going on outside of what I'm doing, so if I need to, I can throw these on while I listen to a podcast or some music, while still being aware of whatever's going on around me. And if you'd like to get the quality of Raycon at an even cheaper cost than it already is, look no further. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/PancreasNoWorkBC to get 20% off the bone conduction headphones. For quality audio, you can do no better than Raycon's. Use my link and grab yourself some today. Now then, take off your clothes. The Fyreslayers in a meta sense are obviously the continuation of Dwarf Slayers into their own army. This isn't something totally unique to them. Zombies were briefly their own faction as well, which made even less sense and was thankfully undone. But in Age of Sigmar's lore, their origins instead descend from Grimnir, one of the two dwarf gods to make it to the setting, and for that matter, one of the two main ones in lore that are usually brought up, aside from Valea. When Sigmar was wandering the mortal realms, beating up random monsters and trying to find friends, he discovered Grungni and Grimnir chained to a mountain. Whatever put them in that predicament is unknown, not due to something like it being lost to time, but because the two dwarf gods refused to tell Sigmar what happened. It's known as the Great Betrayal, but beyond that we have nothing, though presumably it was incredibly embarrassing since two dwarf gods didn't swear a revenge oath, but instead just wanted it forgotten about. Either way, after Sigmar freed them, they each swore an oath to assist him. Grungni, being the calm and collected craftsman god, said Sigmar could take his time and call on him whenever he wanted, but Grimnir's a war god. He wanted to pay his debt back immediately. Sigmar shrugged and pointed him at a sufficiently big monster, the god beast Volcatrix, the mother of the salamanders, and told him to kill it. And no, not the Space Marines, the mythological semi-dragon thing. They fought each other relentlessly to a draw, and it was only a draw because they got a mutual kill on each other. Volcatrix exploded and her fragments turned into the volcanoes in the realm of Akshi, while Grimnir exploded and apparently had a larger blast radius because his remains were scattered across basically all the mortal realms. More on that later. The Fyreslayers themselves believe they're the mortal descendants of Grimnir, though given that some lore states most of the classic fantasy races were already hanging around the mortal realms, there's some timeline shenanigans afoot with that theory. Grimnir did hang around his mortal worshippers for a little bit before committing Majin Vegeta. Maybe he plowed a whole lot of people before his demise. Regardless of the specifics, his worshippers/descendants almost immediately began searching for what was left of him, and in his place they found Urgold. Urgold is the remains of Grimnir, and it's an obviously sacred thing because it's the remnants of their god. They soon discovered that if they hammered it into their bodies, they could supercharge themselves, and they quickly became a faction of mercenaries doing whatever in exchange for gold. While during this age of AOS, a mercenary culture wasn't necessarily the most needed thing, it turned out to be quite helpful when Sigmar's pantheon started breaking apart and chaos arrived into the mortal realms. Whereas everyone else was absolutely going through it, with the exception of Malekith and the Orcs, the Fyreslayers were in heaven. heaven. Suddenly, everyone had quite the need of mercenary contracts to keep themselves from the Chaos hordes, and while they fought all the time, their prowess in battle meant their lodges held strong even after countless sieges by the forces of Chaos. When the Stormcast Eternals made their debut and Sigmar began reclaiming reality, the Fyreslayers only continued to gain more and more people prepared to pay them for their assistance as everyone in the setting collectively shook off their shock and are prepared for war once more. That's not to say it's been perfect for them. For example, when Nagash had the spotlight for a bit, they suffered just as much as anyone else. All those corpses hanging around their lodges from those sieges promptly got back up and came for round 2 when the Necroquake happened. While their walls were of course made of only the finest craft dwarf ship, walls tend to not matter much to ghosts, and the Nighthaunt wreaked havoc wherever they appeared. Grungni's return to the setting has also caused some controversy for the Fyreslayers. On the one hand, he's Grimnir's brother, so he's gotta be at least kinda cool, but on the other hand, he just vanished during the Age of Chaos and only came back after Sigmar and plenty of others were already fighting. When Nagash has in some ways been putting in more effort than you, it's not a good look. People also tend to not trust the Fyreslayers because of their lust for Urgold often appearing to outsiders as nothing but intense greed, and their need for Urgold has led them to take contracts from even the worst sort of people. But Age of Sigmar is still a game with Warhammer in the title, so regardless of any hurt feelings or whatever you might have, the Fyreslayers have yet to see a decline in contracts taken. Though others may grumble about their high prices and gold obsession, they tend to be able to fork up all the cash they need when Khorne is bearing down on their front door. Their armies continue to march in the name of Grimnir even to this day, and though they may not be the most loved faction, they're plenty capable of carving a bloody path through whatever realm they happen to visit. Their lodges hold strong, as does their faith, even though a certain dwarf's return may cause some developments down the line. Let's get into the lore positives, shall we? First off, I will say that it is cool how much the idea of naked dwarfs swearing a death oath has been able to be turned into its own culture and thing, because the Fyreslayers, aside from their aesthetics, are pretty unique. For one, they're kind of like dwarf bees, or ants. Having kids is a very important thing in Fyreslayer culture. Each lodge of them is led by a rune father, who aside from doing all the leader stuff you can think of, wants to have as many kids as possible. These kids, called rune sons because some things don't need to be overcomplicated, act as the rune father's lieutenants in both battle and day-to-day life. Below them is everyone else in whatever role that exists, be that as a rune master, Hearthguard, your standard berserker, or something mundane that's still needed even in a Warhammer setting. Someone has to be the guy to count all the beans and file the tax returns after all. A rune son will eventually be chosen amongst however many there are to become the next rune father, though the ant comparison comes in because sometimes a rune son may strike out on his own to become a rune father of his own lodge. Whether or not this new lodge succeeds is obviously up to the competency of the new rune father in question, as well as of course if some threat or other decides to bulldoze over them. You can be the most competent fire dwarf in history. It doesn't matter much if an entire continent worth of orcs decides it'd be funny to ransack your house. Also of note is that rune mothers and rune daughters also exist, and there's a Warcry band featuring some of these ladies as minis. Yes, they are still naked. It doesn't matter what you've got in your pants amongst Fyreslayer culture, apparently. You will not be wearing clothes. Urgold is, of course, the most prominent thing in their culture. See, aside from being able to supercharge them and being the remnants of Grimnir, they all have a theory about Urgold. After they use the Urgold that's been hammered into their skin, it leaves their body. But that's just how it's been described, at least from how I've read it. It leaves the body. It doesn't fade away into nothing, it leaves. There's a myth that once all the Urgold in the mortal realms has been used up, it'll coalesce back into Grimnir Reborn. This has turned the standard dwarf goldlust into a religiously mandated affair, furthered by the fact that only Fyreslayers can detect Urgold from regular gold. They'll even play it up sometimes because they keep this theory to themselves, acting like they really are just a bunch of greedy bastards trying to collect a Smaug-level treasure hoard when in reality they're searching for their god's remains to bring him back. This search has even led them to occasionally taking mercenary contracts from the forces of chaos itself. There's of course Gotrek reappearing in the mortal realms too, which is causing some strife as well. Gotrek has a very fancy rune embedded in him now, and even before that he grabbed an axe that normally needs a whole lot of Urgold rune magic support to be able to withstand, because he is Gotrek Gurnison and he does not care for what should be possible. This and his general badassery has caused no small number of Fyreslayers to see him as Grimnir Reborn, which is helped by the fact Grimnir is kind of speaking to Gotrek nowadays. Gotrek hates everything about this because Grimnir promised him death and he's very much not dead, but that hardly stops him from looking at him with reverence. There's also still the old style of Slayers amongst the ranks, so there's still some familiarity to be found. They're called Doomseekers, and yeah, they seek doom to atone for sins. I've been rambling on a lot about the same basic point, so since I can't make my thoughts concise to save my life, the takeaway here is that the Fyreslayers Fyreslayers have a good amount going for them once you pop open the hood. As long as they're fighting, they can be fighting for anything from greed to religious reasons to just because it's fun to fight. This army's lore isn't brain-dead simple by any means. There's a lot of fun stuff going on here that can give you all the room you want to play with for your own lore or reasons to fight. Of course, you are still playing dwarfs and all the fun that's involved with that. Beards, axes, and what little clothing they have is of the finest quality possible. Just because they're obsessed with their god gold doesn't mean they're any less proud of what they do and make. I'd certainly hope so, because they hammer Urgold into their skin, and I'd hope that's at least a somewhat quality-controlled profession. Hell, they even still have their great booze. I imagine it all tastes like Fireball, because it's hot, strong, and if you aren't a Fyreslayer, you can barely swallow it. Although, realistically, that just sounds like Fireball without the cinnamon, which sounds hellish. Bit of a repeat for this next one, but that's what happens when the first point was like 6 paragraphs of lore. Fyreslayers give order a nice bit of variety, and an alternative for those who want looser loyalties, as it were, without going full Daughters of Cain murder hobo. The Fyreslayers will fight anyone and for anyone, that's just how they roll, but they're doing it for very specific purposes, and far more understandable ones than others. The Daughters of Cain worship technically Cain at first, and functionally Morathi, with Morathi now openly being their full-blown goddess as Cain kind of reborn. Whoever she wants murdered, they murder, and they just do it. It's loyalty to a goddess, but a psychotic one, and while there is dissent among their ranks, a sizable portion of the daughters are happy to slaughter anyone for any reason. Doesn't matter if it's a Cities of Sigmar soldier, Nagash's legions, chaos, they're just here to kill. By contrast, the Fyreslayers will work with chaos, sure, but only because they need Grimnir back. It strikes me more as a the ends justify the means type of scenario, and I imagine if Grimnir was back, they'd refuse to even consider working with chaos again. I can't say I don't get it even if I disagree. They want their god back. That's a pretty reasonable thing, all things considered. There will be time to consider the ethical ramifications of their actions later. For now, reuniting with Grimnir is all that matters. Some moral flexibility that's actually reasonable is nice to see here, as opposed to Warhammer's usual way of handling that, which is pretending a character is deep because they feel vaguely bad about wearing a skin cape made out of orphans. Night Lords, I'm looking at you. There is also something to be said about them just being plain cool, even if you think they're overdone. These are berserker dwarfs who look like they're on fire, and depending on the unit in question, may actually be on fire, that throw themselves into the thickest of battle on nothing more than the promises of payment and maybe the chance of religious vindication. They show up to battlefields with axes in hand and murder on their minds, and they don't go home until the enemy's dead and payment is collected. They ride flaming lava monsters. You can't tell me that alone isn't at least moderately kick-ass. They are, as an army, able to fight at any scale as well. A Doomseeker can wander into a skirmish and start taking heads, a moderate force can be contracted out to a Cities of Sigmar town to defend it, or an entire lodge can mobilize for war because they want to try and go kick Archaon in the nuts. Fyreslayers don't feel out of place to any scale of engagement you can think of, because even if no one's paid them, it isn't like they don't have their own agency. Your Fyreslayer army could be nomadic if you want. Hell, try that. That certainly goes against the grain for what they usually do, but it'd be a great way to get gold from across the mortal realms if nothing else. That'd even be a nice way to separate them from traditional dwarfs. Their magma holds pouring out lava make for kick-ass art and certainly fit the dwarf mold, but you've got room to experiment with in this army that feels a bit lacking in more traditionally inspired dwarfs. The Fyreslayers also manage to avoid the dying race trope that dwarfs oftentimes face. Because siring children is such an important part of their culture, they're going to spend plenty of time repopulating, as it were. They're hardly the Skaven, where you blink and another 1,000 of them have already been born, but there's one rune father who has 50 rune sons and at least one rune daughter. That dwarf must spend all of the time not in battle going at it like a rabbit with his wife, I swear to Grimnir. So if you like an alternative take on dwarfs that includes them not being the remnants of an age of glories long since past, they're one of the best options for that. A nice place to start here is the average health and tankiness of the Fyreslayers. Now, in terms of saves, I'm not even going to wait for the cons section, it's almost all straight ass. 5-up seems to be standard, and a 6-up is what your basic berserkers have. There's no avoiding that. But there are things to mitigate this. For starters, everything in the army has a 6-up ward save. By no means amazing, but it is something to help out the normal saves when someone breaks out the rend. The standard berserkers also not only get a 5-up ward save when they're nearby a hero unit, but they give the hero one in turn, further helping them out. Speaking of, those same Hearthguard berserkers also have 2 health each, so while they aren't tanky, they require some effort to put down even if wounding them isn't too much of a challenge. Anything on a Magmadroth has 14 wounds, so that makes them pretty hard to chew through, and all your heroes are rocking 5 or 6 wounds as well. Overall, while you're easy to wound in theory, putting you down in practice is going to be the issue for your enemy. Their battle traits also provide a surprising amount of versatility to an army that at first glance seems pretty one-note. Also known as Urgold abilities, they can't be used if you've already used an Urgold ability on that battle round, but that ain't too bad for what you're getting. Once per battle each, you can do the following. At the start of any turn, you can give your units that were charged fight first, pick anyone within 10 inches invisible of any of your units, take D3 mortal damage on a 2-up during the shooting phase, give all your units a ward save of 5 for the rest of the battle round during the hero phase. During a movement phase, you can let all your units run in charge, and during any combat phase, your entire army gets critical wounds for that phase. All of those can let you pull some nasty tricks, even if only once, so don't discard them. Their battle traits are also quite solid for the passives that they give you. You can either add 1 to wound rolls for units that charge that turn, add 2 health to your Magmadroth units, add 1 to save rolls of units wholly in friendly territory, or add 3 to control scores of your heroes, and in addition your heroes can have their control scores modified by enemy abilities. The bonus to your wound rolls or more health for Magmadroth seems the best choices to me, but the control score can be nice since you will have a lot of heroes. You have no spell lore because Age of Sigmar or not, magic is still weird elf crap, but you do have manifestations and prayers. The prayers are divided into Zargrim Blessings and Vulcan Gifts, although it's Vulcan spelled with a Y in place of the A, so no, the Primarch is not on vacation to the mortal realms. Zargrim Blessings are buffs that all have a chanting roll cost of 4. You can subtract 1 from wound rolls targeting a unit, making them even tankier, as well as subtracting from the Ren characteristic from an attack if your chanting roll was 8 or higher. You can make another hero get to fight twice in a phase, albeit with the second round having strikes last, and on an 8 or higher they add 1 to their wound rolls. And you can ignore the battle damaged effect on a Magmadroth, as well as increasing its companion attack amount by 1, which can instead be 1 additional attack per 4 damage taken on an 8+. The Vulcan Gifts, meanwhile, can either let you hurt people who damage a particular unit, add +1 to hit rolls for a particular unit, as well as +2 attacks for a companion if you target a Magmadroth, and letting 1 or 2 units move during their hero phase as if it was their movement phase, with the potential for 2 units doing so on a 10-up casting roll. As for your units, your basic Hearthguard Berserkers come in 2 flavors. You can take either a Broadaxe or a Poleaxe for weapons, and their stat line of 2 health, 6-up save, 1 control, and movement 4 is the same between both. Their weapons also each have 2 attacks, hitting and wounding on 3s with rend 1 and damage 2, which aside from being pretty good for your baseline infantry means the only main difference is their abilities. The Broadaxe Berserkers add +1 to their attack amount when they're close to a wounded Fyreslayer hero, while the Poleaxe lets you roll a d3 and on a 2-up you inflict that many wounds on the unit they're fighting. The Poleaxe also has critical wounds, which is nice, especially because you're hitting at 2 damage, so it's a fairly substantial amount of hurt getting put out. Those Poleaxes are slightly pricier at 120 points compared to the Broadaxe's 110, but it ain't a bad deal either way. Volkite Berserkers, meanwhile, are a bit pricier in exchange either for a bit more reliability or the potential for damage on death. They even have the same stat line as the Fyreslayers for the most part. The Berserkers with bladed sling shields have 2 attacks, hitting on 4s, wounding on 3s at rend 1 and damage 1, but they've at least got a 5-up save. Same for the ones with the Firesteel weapons, minus the save, which on the Firesteel lads is back to a 6-up. The sling shields cost 150 points, and on a model's death, if you roll a 5-up, they deal a point of mortal damage to whatever killed them. The Firesteel weapons Berserkers, meanwhile, cost 130 points, and at the charge get an extra attack. It's unfortunate they're back down to a 6-up save, but hey, extra attacks are extra attacks, I won't complain. Auric Hearthguard, meanwhile, are your shooty units. It ain't the worst in the game, with 12 inches of range and 2 attacks hitting on 4s and wounding on 3s with rend 1 and d3 damage. Their melee isn't phenomenal, but they can shoot even in combat, which gives them some real oomph. The heroes are going to be the highlights of your army, meanwhile, giving you all sorts of helpful abilities to keep this army from being pure unga-bunga charge forward. Fair warning now, this is going to be a massive portion of the video. Let's start with a cheaper fella, the Auric Flamekeeper. 5 health, 4 movement, 5-up save, and 2 control is pretty good for 80 points, and its attack stats are the same as the Hearthguard Berserkers, only with 5 attacks instead of 2. His ability, meanwhile, is based on whether or not you've had any units totally destroyed, and kind of reminds me of the Sisters of Battle abilities. If you've lost at least 1 unit completely, roll a d6. If the roll is equal or less to however many units of yours that have been obliterated, you can pick an effect for the Flamekeeper to give to a nearby unit until your next turns start. You can either give them Ward 5, add 2 to their charge rolls, or 1 more damage to their melee attacks. Your basic units can get a ward save better than their normal save, more reliably enter melee combat, or just hit all that much harder. All of those are nice. The nature of the role does mean there's the potential you get those buffs too late or never get them at all, but for 80 points, I see no reason not to try and gamble on one of these guys. If nothing else, they beat other people over the head plenty well on their own. The Auric Runefather's base stats are the same thing, and his weapon profile is 4 attacks hitting and wounding on 3s with Rend 2 and damage 3. Less volume of attacks, but those attacks are pretty chunky in exchange. Once again, for 140 points, this isn't too bad a deal, but his abilities are where things get nasty. Commanding Presence is nice, but situational, adding whatever battle round number it is to the control score of nearby Fyreslayers infantry for the rest of the turn. Obviously not a combat power, but the potential to out-control score a Skaven player is if nothing else at least a really funny possibility. The Royal Retinue, however, is the real meat and potatoes here. During deployment, pick a non-hero infantry unit. Whenever they're wholly within 6 inches of the Runefather, they add +1 to their hit rolls and have 4-up ward. A 4-up ward save, because go to hell, people trying to wound you. And since it just says add 1 to hit rolls and not specifying which ones, you can throw this on the Auric Hearthguard and get them to a 3-up to hit with their Fire Pike's ranged attacks. Or have your Blava Berserkers all hit on 2s. He's decently killy on his own, and he can make the fellas around him that much better. Not a bad choice at all. The Rune Master, meanwhile, gives army-wide buffs based on which of those Urgold abilities you've used. Same base stats as the Runefather, and he's got 3 attacks hitting and wounding on 3s at Rend 1 and damage 2. Not as killy, but the following buffs are good. Every time a chant roll of his is answered, aka you succeed on the roll, you get yourself a Magmic Power token. Once you have 3, you can remove them and give your army a buff based on which Urgold ability you used. Your options are +1 to wound rolls for the rest of the battle round, +1 to save rolls for the rest of the round, +1 to run and charge rolls for the rest of the round, +1 to rend for the rest of the battle round, or increase the range of that basically free D3 of damage ability to 16 inches. At 180 points, he isn't too cheap, and since you gain those Magmic Power tokens by praying, they won't come into effect for a little bit. But the payoff is some pretty powerful buffs that affect the entire army for a whole turn, not something to be disregarded by any means. Since he's a priest and the Fyreslayers have decent enough prayers, you may as well have the fellow regardless. The Rune Smiter, meanwhile, is 120 points and actually has another attack compared to the Rune Master, but he doesn't give all those fancy buffs. Instead, he and another unit can go underground during deployment, and they tunnel above onto the battlefield during your hero phase at some point in the future, 9 inches away from any enemy units, of course. Less flashy than the Rune Master's abilities, but suddenly vomiting almost a dozen angry dwarfs onto a unit of unprepared archers or a cannon can certainly throw your enemy's plans into the garbage if you do it well. Hell, you can just do it for movement if you want, which would normally be moronic and even now probably still isn't a good idea, but we'll talk about their movements soon enough for why you might be desperate enough to try that. Runesons are in lore, of course, the Runefather's kids, here to prove themselves worthy of the title once the time to choose has come. The stat line still hasn't changed, and while their weapon stats are also basically just the standard Berserkers only with 5 attacks, they do have an extra rend against monstrous units. What better way to prove yourself to daddy than to bring home a giant's head after all? Their abilities are also quite nice, not necessarily as match-defining as the Rune Masters can be, but still good. You can add +1 to charge rolls for friendly Fyreslayer units wholly within 18 inches of the guy, and you can let a Fyreslayer in combat range of you that's just finished fighting fight again. This guy should be in the thick of things, which while, yeah, might deprive a Runefather of his son, does mean whatever you charge him and his friends into with is gonna probably have a bad day. I should also inform you, viewer, that we are not even halfway through the heroes. I will try and expedite at least a few of the ones left. Battlesmiths are pretty simple. They let nearby units ignore any modifiers to the control score, and if a nearby unit uses the rally command to bring back some troops with, you can roll 3 more d6s when you do so. Anything that brings back or heals models is good, and this fellow lets you do it more reliably. Doomseekers are just here to kill things. They pick a unit to be able to hit harder during your deployment phase, which also takes 3 damage no questions asked if the Doomseeker dies in combat against it, and he does more damage the more wounds he takes. For 80 points, throw him at something that's bothering you and you'll probably make your money's worth with him. A Grimhold Exile, meanwhile, is like a different flavor of Doomseeker. In the lore, they're like Doomseekers but sadder, as they're the last survivors of their fallen hold and they wander seeking vengeance. On tabletop, once per battle, they can roll 1d6 per total health of an enemy they're in combat with. So if an enemy unit has 12 health, you roll 12d6. On a 4-up, they deal damage, and yes, this means with absurd luck, these guys can theoretically one-shot anything in the game. Once per battle, they can also let up to 3 units wholly within 12 inches of them re-roll charge rolls. Always nice to see. We've also finally got a hero with 6 health instead of 5, and their weapon stat line is 5 attacks hitting and wounding on 3s at Rend 2 and damage 3. At 110 points, they're a bit pricier than a Doomseeker, but with that ability to just hurt whatever they're facing on a 4-up for potentially all their health, they're well worth it. And for our last foot hero, because there are more afterwards, the Grimwrath Berserker. He's thankfully very simple. Once during a battle, he can fight twice, getting fights last on the second go-around, and before battle during deployment, he chooses one of 2 oaths. One oath gives him +1 to ward save and hit rolls when he's nearby another hero, and it goes away if that hero is destroyed. Another lets him add 1 to charge rolls and save rolls while he's in combat, and if he retreats or rallies, it goes away. His stat line is the same as almost every hero I've talked about, and his weapon stats are also basically the same, with good old reliable 5 attacks, hitting and wounding on 3s, rend and damage too. Almost done now, I promise, it's just the Magmadroth heroes left. There's only 3 more, I swear, and I'm going to stop being so specific with the attack numbers. All the Magmadroths have 10 inches of movement, 14 health, a 4-up save, and 5 control. They also all share a ranged attack, which is solid and great for dealing with infantry. For the Auric Runefather on 1, its melee attacks are either a nice reliable hit and wound on 3s, or hitting on 4 and then wounding on a 2, because Lava Dinosaur. It can make an enemy unit have a worse save roll, once a battle give everyone around him an extra attack, and whenever you roll a save of 1, it hurts your opponent. That last ability is another one shared by all Magmadroth units. Nice to see. The Runesmiter on Magmadroth buffs wound rolls for a unit nearby him, and can cut through blobs of infantry quite well with the Tail Lash ability. And the Rune Sun on Magmadroth, much like his infantry counterpart, should be fighting monsters, because every time it kills one, you get an extra attack. It can even make an enemy monster's control score go lower, depending on how many wounds it has left. These units range from 260 to 320 points, so if you want to fill out your army as cheaply as possible for real-life money, grab some of them. Sweet Christ, I can finally stop talking about units. Anyways, for the last few things, painting them won't be too bad. Magmadroth ignored, it's just flesh, red hair, metal, and gold. Sure, there are some fiddly bits like jewelry and the flames on the axes, but speaking from painting Gotrek, making the axes at least look good doesn't actually take too much work, just a moderately steady hand. And as an AOS original army, they're all fairly new and modern looking sculpts. Some of the models, like the front guy and the Volkite Berserkers, were clearly just mirrored in development, but the quality of the models is all good. No 30-year-old models hiding in their ranks, it's all new stuff. Alright, lore downsides now. Time to be mean. Well, I think the lore for this faction is quite nice, no doubt helped by the fact that the first people Gotrek finds in his first book, so I have positive memories of them for that. There's some issues. For one, if you want proper dwarfs of old, you're shit out of luck. Constant grudges and technological supremacy and whatnot is not what these guys are about. Sure, they don't like people that slighted them, but the emphasis has changed here. AOS by and large doesn't have something that is just fantasies dwarfs updated, which is nice for being unique, but if you miss the good old times, you're not gonna quite scratch the itch with the Fyreslayers. They're also on the eviler end of Grand Alliance Order. Like I said, they've worked for Chaos before. I understand the reasoning and I can accept it. I don't think it's bad writing. But regardless of it being understandable, them believing the ends justify the means has caused them to work with and fight alongside the people who blew up the last setting and are trying for this one as well. On the whole, at the moment, they don't care about the good guys any more than how they can help them reforge Grimnir. They aren't corrupted by chaos, but they'll do some messed up stuff. There's even a curse/illness they can suffer from called Glimmerlust, where they become obsessed with Urgold and will happily murder their kinsmen to get more of it. This isn't a necessarily universal thing. Your own homebrew army could be a Runeson disgusted with his lodge's actions that struck out on his own to be a morally good army, or as morally good as mercenaries can be at any rate. But by and large, you're an army with few allies even if you got many customers, and if peace was somehow returned to the mortal realms, you'd likely have a lot to answer for with a Fyreslayer army. Hell, if Grimnir was reforged first, I bet a lot of the lodges would still likely have things to answer for. I can't imagine he would be happy with them for what they've done, which admittedly is narratively interesting, but not helping the bad guy allegations. They're also kind of on their own even at the divine level. A lot of them don't like Grungni, and Grimnir is dead. The other gods might be willing to lend a hand depending on circumstances, but you're one of the few Age of Sigmar factions that beyond prayer summonings doesn't really have their god behind them. Grimnir is in pieces that they use to empower themselves, which is undeniably awesome, but it means that he isn't really throwing down against other gods like what Teclis and Nagash can do. The closest they have to that is Gotrek, who despises every time someone calls him Grimnir Reborn. To repeat, the closest thing they have to their god coming back is an angry man whose first actions in the mortal realms was to punch one of them in the face and call them a bunch of inherently incorrect dwarfs. Not exactly looking great on that front. They do share some of this with the Carrigan Overlords, who also don't really have a god backing them up, but they hate gods, so that doesn't really count as a downside for them. And while they aren't exactly suffering from dying race syndrome like what dwarfs usually are, they aren't exactly brimming with numbers either. Even with them being obsessed with having kids, you aren't going to outnumber the Skaven or even the cities of Sigmar. So battles you lose are narratively going to put a dent in the overall numbers, even if it isn't a species endangerment level event like it was in fantasy with the dwarfs. Let's start with what at least I think to be the obvious ones. For one, this is not a shooting army. The Magmadroth can breathe fire, that's good, and the Auric Hearthguard have spear guns, also good. You also have the one Urgold ability to throw some axes in someone's face. Again, not bad at all. But that's it. This can be a nice little surprise to soften up an enemy before closing in for the kill, but the Fyreslayers are not a ranged army. If you don't at some point have the ability to close in and start swinging, you better hope to God you control all the objectives, or you just gotta accept you've lost the match. Not helping this is that your army is slow as hell. 4 inches of movement is standard, and while this is very fitting to dwarfs, I feel justified in expecting slightly more movement speed from the melee brawlers who aren't wearing any armor. 4 inches of movement is acceptable enough in Warhammer Fantasy, where the dwarfs are 90% forming a gun line and hoping to kill everyone before they reach you, but in Age of Sigmar that kind of hurts to look at for movement stats. Enjoy rolling a 1 on your charge roll and moving 5 inches forward, because aside from the Magmadroth, no one is going anywhere fast. Ranged armies will laugh at you as you eat 500 bullets to the face, and I'm pretty sure someone running a mostly Scry or Skaven army is going to be rock hard when they see their opponent is running Fyreslayers. I know they're dwarfs and dwarfs are slow, but I really don't feel like I should be comparing their movement to the Tomb King's standard skeleton warriors. Now you do have a fair amount of ways to mitigate these flaws, which is nice, but those of you with keen ears will notice I spent about 50% of this video talking about nothing but all the great things heroes can do for you. And that's because heroes are what makes the Fyreslayers truly great. With them, you can mitigate your army's issues, like your dog-ass saves and slow movement, or let them hit even harder. Without them, you're going to feel just a little bit impotent. It isn't as bad as undead armies, where without your heroes you might as well just shove your head up your ass until your opponent says that they won the game, but things certainly aren't great without them. The heroes are varied, which goes a long way in making this army feel unique, but it also means to get the best possible army compositions and tactics, you need a lot of them, both eating up your points fast and flashing neon signs to your opponent when it comes to where they should focus. Your standard Berserker infantry is good even without a hero, but if you want more than Unga Bunga Smash, or even if you just want Unga Bunga Smash at optimal levels, you need your heroes alive. They've also got zero magic, and at least right now in 4th edition, I don't think they've really even got ways to mitigate enemy magic. I know they used to, and I will fully admit that sometimes I completely miss rules, so maybe it's they're hiding and I've just missed it. But even if that is the case, they don't have a lot of ways to counter magic, so understand going into this army that your counter to magic is going to mostly be politely asking your opponent to not cast any spells, or killing them before they can do so, which at movement 4 for everything but the Magmadroth might be a tall order. To once again go back to the heroes, because there's no escaping that with this army, this is more of a tragedy than anything because they have so many. But take a guess on how many named characters exist in the Fyreslayer roster. Go on, I'll wait. Take the wildest guess possible. Did you guess only Gotrek? Because that's it. And anyone can use Gotrek in Grand Alliance Order. There's not a single actual unique character in the roster, which is just a tragedy. I'm not asking for the Fyreslayer Heresy series here, GW, just 1 or 2 dudes with names. Relatedly, when it comes to your standard units that aren't heroes, you've only got a few options, so the bulk of your army will be playing pretty similarly, especially if they don't happen to have a hero nearby. Between that and the no-named characters, this army seems like it's overflowing with wasted potential. I mean, just imagine something like mini Magmadroth cavalry or chariots. There's still a few easy things GW could do with the theme to keep it consistent yet also new, but the Fyreslayers seem to be almost embarrassing for GW with how little love they've gotten. And while other heroes do mean that they're not totally one note, it also means it's a fairly complex army. Much like their lore does with Slayers, you're taking the concept of a mostly melee-only army and fleshing it out as much as possible. This is good and fun, but you might get a bit paralyzed for choice when list building and even mid-game looking at the trillion different abilities you have on offer. Monetarily, these guys are also a bit on the pricier end. Not Skaven or Imperial Guard pricey, but depending on what heroes you get and what infantry you take, you can start racking up costs very quickly. Some of their heroes being under 100 points means you yourself may begin mugging people in the hopes that their wallets contain Urgold, so be wary of that. Their Spearhead box on the bright side does contain a whole lot of Volkite Berserkers, which is great, and I'm gonna be honest with you, you can probably call your Battlesmith a different model every time and no one will be able to call you out on it. This is balanced out, however, by the Fyreslayer Spearhead box being one of the most boring and uninspired ones to ever exist. And finally, to bring us full circle, their last problem. Do you know why I have full confidence in saying the Fyreslayers are an easy army to paint? Because even if I'm actually completely wrong and they're insanely hard to paint and I just got incredibly lucky painting Gotrek, or if flesh painting is your kryptonite, they will still become an easy army to paint. And this is because this army has zero visual variety. You are going to be painting so many short, hairy, naked redheads that you're probably going to start seeing Fyreslayers in your dreams. This is ultimately what I meant when I said making an army entirely out of Slayers isn't perhaps the best decision. Everything looks the same in this army. Naked guy with an axe, naked guy with 2 axes, naked guy with 2 hammers. The Magmadroths are hard carrying this army's variety visually. Hell, I can see this causing gameplay problems for all that this isn't specifically a rules complaint. Even if this was my main army I collected and played for Age of Sigmar, I'm sure that even after a few years of owning them, I would still get confused on which unit is which at a glance, because it's nothing but short, hairy, naked redheads. And no, those Warcry models being women doesn't help. I am looking at minis from the top down because I myself am not 2 feet tall. Even if I own them, I'm not going to be seeing anything but another batch of short, hairy, naked redheads. So congratulations on quite the accomplishment, GW. You made Dwarf Slayer models that look kick-ass all around. Then you put them all in the same army, and now they look boring again because of it. And that was the Fyreslayers. A bit one note all around, but credit where credit is due. That note has been pushed to as far as it can go, and then a bit farther. Even if you don't play them, I'd at least look into their lore a bit, because it is genuinely fun. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Rune Sons to my Fyreslayers, the short, hairy, naked redheads standing out taller than the rest. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Hell, even if you don't play Fyreslayers as Fyreslayers, you may as well buy a couple if you play dwarfs in the old world. They made the bases a bit bigger. With some creative modeling, you can make them fit on old world bases. Or alternatively, just start hiding Fyreslayers around a friend's house. Slowly drive them insane as they keep finding short, hairy, naked redheads everywhere they look.